5 ways how to sew knits without a serger. I love working with knit fabrics, and these tips will help you sew knits even if you don't have a serger. This video is created in partnership with Mettler, manufacturer of high-quality threads. I will start right away with my favorite method to sew knits is using straight stitch and sewing with elastic thread. So this method has been my favorite method to sew knits without a serger for the last 3 years when Mettler released their thread Serger. So what is elastic thread? From the first look, it doesn't look that much difference from polyester all-purpose thread, which is most common sewing thread. But the difference becomes clear when you try to stretch each thread. When you try to stretch polyester all-purpose thread, it doesn't really stretch. But when you try to stretch the stretch elastic thread, it does stretch quite a bit. This thread is elastic thanks to the innovative raw material PTT, which is used in the production of this thread. And because of that stretch, when you sew any seam on knit garments using this thread and a standard straight stitch on your sewing machine, you get an elastic seam. So even though I do have a serger at home, I very often use this method, especially when I'm working with lightweight knits or medium weight knit fabrics. And the reason why I love to use this particular method is that it allows me to use different seam finishes that I can create using a serger. For example, I am able to sew just a simple straight stitch and get an elastic seam, which is a function that many sergers do not have. Also, I am able to sew an elastic rolled hem, whichever width I prefer. I'm also able to create French seam on very fine knit fabrics. And I can even use this thread, pair it with binding foot and create a lasting binding and attach it using just one seam, and the seam will keep its elasticity. Serger is used as the top and bobbin thread. Release the tension to sew with this thread and simply sew with a straight stitch. This is a very easy method how you can sew a variety of different knits, use a variety of different styles of seam finishes and get great results even without serger. Second way how you can sew knits without serger is stretching the fabric and sewing it with a straight seam. This method and all other methods that we will be continuing discussing in this video will be made using a standard all-purpose polyester thread. So this particular method is very similar to the previous method that we discussed, but instead of using a stretch thread, we are stretching the fabric and sewing it with a straight seam. So what happens with this method? When you stretch fabric, sew a straight seam, the stitches are made on a stretched fabric. When you release the fabric, the stitches kind of jump and kind of shrink. So the next time when you're wearing the garment and you stretch the seam, it flattens out and returns to its initial position, so it does have quite a good ease and it does not break. For comparison, if you would just sew a straight stitch on knit garments without stretching the fabric itself, the next time you're wearing the garment, you try to stretch it, the seam would pop. So this particular method, stretching the fabric and sewing it with a straight seam, is the method that I used prior to starting using the stretch thread. And this method is often used by professionals who use industrial sewing machines that have only straight stitch. While this method is great and it definitely works, there are a few things that you need to know before starting using it. Now, because we're sewing on a stretched fabric, the moment you finish the seam might look a bit wavy. The fabric will be easily flattened out with just a little bit of steam and pressing. So if you get that wavy seam using this method, don't get scared and try to iron it first. Another thing that you need to know about this particular method is that you have to always keep stretching the fabric when you sew, and you need to try to keep it it stretched at the same distance all the time, because you want your seam to have equal elasticity all throughout the seam. This method does take a little bit of practice and patience, but it can be done and it turns out wonderfully. Third way how I like to sew knits without a serger at home is using twin needle. So twin needle is threaded at the top with two separate threads. When you sew a seam using twin needle, at the top you get 2 rows of stitches, and at the bottom, at the inside of the garment, you get a zigzag. Because of that zigzag, when you stretch the seam does not break and is elastic. Now, this method is not actually a substitute for serger, but more a substitute for cover lock. And I like to use this method particularly when I'm working on elastic hems, or for example, if I'm making swimwear. Fourth way how you can sew knits at home without a serger is using a zigzag. Zigzag stitch looks like this, and because of its nature, it already has a little bit of elasticity, but because it can be moved like this. Now, to use this method, what you want to do is you want to use a very narrow zigzag, because the moment you stretch both layers together, if the zigzag is very wide, these stitches will be visible on the outside of the garment. Also, you want to use a zigzag length, which is a little bit longer than your usual stitch length. So let's say if you're using 2.5 millimeter, which is the standard stitch length, to sew with the zigzag knit fabrics, you would like to use 3 millimeter stitch length. I have to be honest with you, out of all the methods I will talk in this video, zigzag stitch is my least favorite method, because it does create kind of that a little bit curvy seam, and I don't like when it is used, especially on the top stitching. But nonetheless, this method works. A lot of sewists love using this method, so you can give it a try and see how you like it yourself. Fifth and final way how you can sew knits at home without serger is using elastic stitches if it's available on your domestic sewing machine. So nowadays, a lot of modern domestic sewing machines have these elastic stitch options. So what is elastic stitch? So the standard straight stitch is created one stitch, then next stitch, then next stitch, then next stitch. But the elastic straight stitch does the same stitch 3 times. So it goes 1, 2, 3 before moving to another stitch, and because of that you get elastic durable seam. Now, the availability of these stitches highly depend on what kind of sewing machine you have and what stitches are available on this machine. Prior to getting a serger myself, I like to use the mock overlock stitch on my domestic sewing machine, because it not only bonds 2 layers of knit fabrics, but also it protects the raw seam allowance from fraying. Now, the downside of these particular stitches is because it does the stitching 3 times, it takes 3 times longer to create the seam. Also, from my personal experience, these elastic stitches don't always work well with all kinds of knit fabrics, and using the elastic stitches sometimes, not always, but sometimes my fabric would get sucked into the plate. So again, if you want to see if your sewing machine has elastic stitches available, I do recommend reading the manual and checking for your particular sewing machine model. So here are all 5 ways how to sew knits at home without a serger, and if you're looking into sewing knit garments, I think you will enjoy this video where I share tips on working with knit fabrics. Thank you so much for watching today, and I will see you next time. Bye!